life and accomplishments and times of Rabbi Meir Shapiro, who was known to us as the Rabbi of Lublin, and in his short life was one of the most influential and different figures that the Jewish people had in the last century. The period of his life, some people have the good fortune or the misfortune, depending how you look at it, of living in very turbulent times. And those people who live in very turbulent times, their lives oftentimes mean more or have a greater influence than people who live in more tranquil or normal times. Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States during the American Civil War. It could very well have been that he would have been a great president any time that he would have been president. But because he was the president during the Civil War, that enhanced his opportunity, so to speak. And whatever he did was that much more meaningful. Somebody that was president in the 1820s or 1830s or even 1840s or later in the 1870s or 1880s, even though those are important people, and history every time is important, but sometimes they're much more dramatic. And Rabbi Meir Shapiro lived in a very dramatic time. He was born in 1887 in the little town of Shat, which is today in Bukovina in Romania. Then it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and on the border with Russia. Shat was a great Jewish town because it had three borders. And any town where there are three borders, so then Jews could always make a living, especially in Eastern Europe, because of the mercantile opportunities that presented themselves, legal and otherwise. And it was a center of Jewish learning and a center of Jewish knowledge, and it was an important town. The 1880s were marked already by the beginning of institutionalized anti-Semitism. The difference between modern anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism of the Middle Ages is that modern anti-Semitism is institutionalized. By institutionalized, I mean it's government supported. It's an arm of the governmental process. It's organized. And because of government control, it can be turned on and off almost at will. And in the 1880s, the Tsar of Russia began his series of terrible persecutions and pogroms of the Jewish people in order to force them to leave Russia, in order to force them to assimilate. And Romania, this part of Russia, Bessarabia, Bukovina, did not need much encouragement. The local populace was always very anti-Semitic. Jews, even though they had lived there for hundreds of years, always lived there uncomfortably. Later on in the Second World War, the Romanian Iron Guard was guilty of some of the worst atrocities, sometimes even more horrid than what the Nazis did. And the Jews lived there under difficult conditions. Because of that, therefore, it is not strange for us to note that the enlightened Jews, the Haskalah, the secular Jews, began to play a great role in Jewish life, because they claimed that they had a solution for the Jewish problem. They claimed that they had a way to solve the anti-Semitism. We know now, 80 years later, 90 years later, 100 years later, that their solution did not work. And that just as the Zionist solution did not work, so to speak, as far as the problem of anti-Semitism is concerned, the State of Israel did not diminish anti-Semitism in the world. If anything, it has increased it and focalized it and given it a diplomatic and political veneer that it never enjoyed before. Because today hindsight, and history rarely allows us that luxury. In the 1880s, a large section of the Jewish people was convinced that somehow by being less Jewish, the Jewish problem would be solved. By accommodating themselves to the society, that would be solved. Now you have to remember this, I feel, because this will place Rabbi Shapiro's life in a perspective, because this is the problem that he dealt with his entire life. The problem was that a large section of the Jewish people in Poland, in Russia, in Romania, throughout the Jewish world, felt that the ideal solution to the problem of anti-Semitism was by being less Jewish, less visibly Jewish, less viscerally Jewish, by less observance, less tradition, and because of the terrible pressure that existed upon the Jewish people, so almost any solution that you would propose, you would have adherents. If you wanted to say, it will solve the problem of anti-Semitism, everybody should dye their hair green, you would get a certain number of Jews that would say, gee, that's a great idea, let's dye our hair green. Let's try and reach a solution on that basis. So, because of all of these reasons, Rabbi Shapiro's life is going to be a tremendously turbulent life. Because within traditional Jewry, there also will be great schisms to understand how to deal with this problem. Religious Jewry also didn't have a pat answer. And he who proposed certain answers and far-reaching solutions would always find opposition, would always find that there were people that opposed him. Rabbi Shapiro was first and foremost an absolute raving genius, as all rabbis, but some exhibit it more than others. He was a man of photographic memory, enormous intellect, a speed reader, a linguist. He was a child prodigy. He was just an unusual person in every imaginable fashion. He also was a very handsome person, with aristocratic bearing. He was raised in a Hasidic family, and he himself was a Chassid, but he was a Chassid that was not, I don't mean to be misunderstood, but he was not narrow in Chassidus. His influence was far beyond Chassidus, so he remained a loyal Chassid all of his life. Once he met a Misnagdic rabbi, and they met in the baths at Marienbad, and they were discussing a matter in Halacha, in the Gemara, and the Misnagid was also a great Talmud Chacham, a great Rosh Yeshiva, a great Talmud Chacham, and he made a certain halachic statement. So Rabbi Shapiro said, it can't be, that's not true. He said, Taisus never said that. That doesn't appear. So he says, I'll bet you that it does. He says, I'll bet you it doesn't. So they said, well, what should they bet? So he said, we'll bet as follows. If you were right, he says, I'll become a chassid. And if I'm right, then you become a misnagid. So Rabbi Shapiro answered him cleverly. He said, that's not an even bet. He said, you're offering me $1,000 and I have to put up $1 million. He said, that's not even. So he was a chassid all of his life, very strong chassid, but he was he represented in himself literally all of the positive attributes of Chassidus, joy and song. He was a great musician. He was a poet. We have his poetry in Hebrew and in Yiddish and even in Polish. And he was a person who composed music, who played musical instruments. He was a far different type of personality. He's not the ordinary person. He was an extraordinary person. And even when he was a young child, his extraordinariness, if there's such a word, showed. So that by the age of 9, he was the star in the city of Shach. People used to come, rabbis would come to test him. It was like among the Jews in the Old West, right? The gunslingers came to town to shoot it out with Billy the Kid, right? You wanted to see if you were good. So if you weren't good enough, you got killed. But at least it was a good chance to see whether you had it or not. And among the Jews in Eastern Europe, the contest was to give tests to little children that were geniuses, to see how good you were. He had Meir Shapiro had a Zayda, the famous author of the Sefer Minchas Shai, which is a Sefer on Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, on Tanakh. It's more than a grammatical book. It's really a textual concordance regarding the entire Bible. That was his Zayda, and his Zayda learned with him. His father was a businessman. His father was in business most of the day. But his Zayda had his grandfather at the time, and he learned with him. And by the time the child was 9, as an example, he took an exam on all of the Shulchan Aruch Yeridea, which is the exam that is given for smicha, which is the exam that's given for rabbinic ordination. He took it at the age of 9. And he had great rabbis that came to give him these types of exams. The greatest one at that time in that area of the world was the great Rabbi Sholem HaKohen Meberzan, the Berzhaner Rov, the Marsham, was a great genius, and he was a great Shoel HaMeshiv. He was the greatest posek in that area of Poland. So after he finished talking with the child in Torah for a few hours, so he said about him, one could make the blessing, Boruch Yotzer HaMaoros. Blessed is God who has created the great lights in the world. That's the bracha that we make about the sun and the moon. So high an opinion that he have of this wonder child. Now, the problem with wonder children, I often mention, what happens to all the beautiful babies? When they grow up and they're not so beautiful. And what happens to all the beautiful brides, right? So the other part of the question is what always happens to the child prodigies in the yeshivas and in the day schools and the children that know 1,000 mishnayos by heart? I mean, where are they when we need them? 20 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later. It's one of the difficult things. One of the most difficult things is to raise a gifted child into becoming a productive adult. I think it's far harder in many instances than in raising an average child into being a productive adult. And in the long history of the Jewish people, we have countless examples of great children that didn't become great adults. But here is the exception that proves the rule. Just as the Gaon of Vilna was such an exception that proved the rule, that he was a genius and a child prodigy, and he grew into the great Gaon of Vilna. Here, Meir Shapiro is a genius and a child prodigy, and he will be able to sustain it in adult life in a fashion that gave credence to his earlier genius. Also the nature, by the way, you have to trust me on this, but the nature of a gifted child is that he is spoiled. That's by definition. He's doted upon, he's spoiled. If the Berzhaner Rav comes to give you a bechina and talks to you, and you're 9 years old and the Berzhaner Rav is 75, and he has no child is that stupid not to realize that he is special, not to realize the level that he's being dealt with. And therefore, it is part of the problem, so to speak, part of the burden, at least, of being a gifted child, is that those children tend to be arrogant, have a tendency to have a great deal of hubris and false pride, and not to be realistic about the world. And they're accustomed that everything should be done for them and everybody should love them. They're very thin-skinned. If you want to be in Jewish public life, those are qualities that will not stand you in good stead. I think that that's part of the reason why so many gifted children never became great rabbis or great teachers or great public leaders, because psychologically you're not trained for what the real world is. The real world is that, that 99% of the people couldn't care less what you have to say, and the other 1% oppose you. And because of that, so you have to have a thick skin, and you have to lower your ego, and you have to lower your expectations. Again, Rabbi Meir Shapiro is an exception because he was able to be the child prodigy and to have all of these great things happen to him, and somehow it really did not cripple him in terms of his later life. I've known in my life, especially one very gifted genius who I had the ability to study under him for a number of years, not in the yeshiva, but afterwards when I was already out of the yeshiva, and he lived in Chicago. An absolute tremendous genius. He was, one of those geniuses who could play 10 chess games at once while he's teaching Gemara and he's reading the newspaper at the same time. And that's literally, I used to do that regularly. But he never, he was 9 years old when he was 9, and he was 9 years old when he was 18, and he was 9 years old when he was 49, and he's 9 years old now when he's 69. And because of that, therefore, he's not the greatest leader of the Jewish people that he could be. So one has to always be careful when we speak about gifted children, when we speak about geniuses at an early age. The signals are crossed. They're mixed. That's not 100%. And part of the genius of Meir Shapiro was that he somehow overcame all of this. He overcame the fact that he was very handsome, and he overcame his personality, because these are all the milas, all the great assets and great compliments can be negative. There are people in life who are too handsome. There are women that are too beautiful. Most of the time, if one is too beautiful, then when life has a way of getting even. If one is too handsome, or one is too wealthy, one is too strong. If you're too much of anything, it's harder to deal with in life. And therefore, that's a rule that we have regarding great prodigies. But Meir Shapiro was a prodigy, was able to overcome it. At the age of 15, he moved to Chernowitz. Chernowitz was the great, today it's in Russia. Russia borrowed a few hundred miles in Romania after the Second World War, and they moved Romania over. But then it was in Romania with a great Jewish center and a great Jewish center of learning. And it had not a yeshiva in our sense of an organized yeshiva, but it had a collection of very intelligent, near genius young men who learned with great rabbis in Chernowitz. And he was one of that group. And by the age of 15, he already had received smicha from some of the great rabbis of the time. And giving smicha to someone 15 years old, so they have to have a great confidence. And the rabbis who gave him smicha, aside from his grandfather, Mincha Shai, the great Rabbi Arik from Romania, and the Marsham himself, the Berjan Arov, these were people of tremendous note and tremendous leadership, and the fact that if you had a letter from them, so it meant that you were somebody. If you had smicha from them and you were 15, it really meant that you were someone. Now, when he was 16, he entered into an engagement with his wife, who was the daughter of a very wealthy merchant from the Polish Galician city of Tarnopol. Tarnopol was a center of Jewish learning in Galicia, famous city with famous rabbonim, and it had all, the Galicianers have a certain charm to them, all rumors to the contrary notwithstanding, and it had a life and vibrancy, quickness, cleverness, and his father-in-law was a Jew by the name of Yaakov David Breitman, who was the wealthiest Jew in Tarnopol, who lived in a mansion, and who was a very, very wealthy man. Not just wealthy in terms of money, but, a guy with real money. A real person. He really had money. And he promised that he would support the Meir Shapiro the rest of his life, financially. The only thing wrong with that promise was that it was made in 1902, in 1903. And within 11 years, he would be destitute, because the First World War would wipe him out, and it would wipe out most of Europe. So all man-made promises, all man-made promises, especially in these areas, fathers-in-law promises. The wisest son-in-law would be well taken to, not to take them with a grain of salt, but to realize that no matter how well-intentioned, the promise cannot always be fulfilled, and therefore there must be some other reliance. There must be some other way that you're going to make your way in life. Meir Shapiro, interestingly enough, refused his father-in-law's offer. And he said that he was going to sit and learn until such time that he felt that he was ready to assume the mantle of rabbinic leadership. That's the literal translation of what he told him in Yiddish. And that when he felt he was ready, he was going to leave. But that his father-in-law should not think that he was going to support him for the rest of his life. It's also very interesting to know that his father-in-law, and especially his mother-in-law, there's a special Masechta in the Talmud called mothers-in-law, right? That his mother-in-law opposed his going into the rabbinate bitterly. I'll tell you an anecdote about it in a moment. Ferociously. Whether he saw it as an act of independence on his part, which undoubtedly was part of it. It's very hard to live off of other people. I think one of the main drawbacks in the rabbinate that I have always found is that in essence you're living off of other people, even though at least it's dressed up in a more palatable fashion. But when all is said and done, other people are giving to support you, which is at least to certain people, it's not easy to deal with life that way. But it certainly is not easy if you know the hand that's giving you. And it's certainly not easy if you're living in the same house as the hand that's giving you. And many times the more that is given, the less it is appreciated, the harder it is to take. So it could be that Meir Shapiro's drive for the Rabbonis was because he wanted to get out of that situation. Though in reading his writings and his speeches, one is struck immediately by the fact that he feels that he was born for a mission, which that really haunted him all of his life, that sense of mission, that God had given him certain gifts, and that he had to use them for the benefit of the Jewish people, and that by going into public life, that was the only way he could use them. He was also haunted his entire life by the fact that he had a premonition that he would die young, which he did. He was a sickly child. Apparently, reconstructing it, he had rheumatic fever when he was a young child, which was very common at that time. Apparently, he had the damaged heart all of his life. He was always prone to colds and to influenza and was very sick with pneumonia when he was a young man. And at that time, at the turn of the century or the early 1900s, before the type of medicine that we have today and the type of drugs and antibiotics, etc., those things left a scar on one's health. He once remarked of Meir Shapiro, he said, if I live to be 50, he said, I'll be able to head hundreds of thousands of Jews. But he never made it to 50. But it's interesting that that was like his goal in life. He couldn't expect more than 50. And so this also was part of the drive. If a person, God forbid, is aware that he has only 20 years to go or 30 years to go, so he's not going to stay in his father-in-law. He hasn't got time to stay in his father-in-law's house. He's driven by the sense of his mortality. And Meir Shapiro, it's striking. If you read his speeches, his articles, it comes through between the lines that here's a person that the angel of death is looking over his shoulder. And that everything that he does is in spite of that. His joy, his energy, his determination, his far-sighted vision, everything is in spite of the fact that he knows that his days are very numbered. That only enhances the person and makes his reputation greater and gives us an idea of what he is. When he was 27 years old, which is the year that he left his father-in-law's house, right at the eve of the First World War, he had written a book, famous book called the Imre Das, which was a book of halachic essays, great work. And here we have also, he had a premonition of tragedy his entire life, aside from the premonition of early death, but a premonition of tragedy, that he was stalked by tragedy. As we see in his life, it was a fairly tragic one. So that he wrote the book, and he brought it to the printer, and they worked on it, and they re-edited it, and they printed it, and they bound it, and the book, somehow, every copy of the book was burned on the way back from the printer. It got caught in a fire, and the copies that were not burned were lost, so that he worked on the book 10 years. So 10 years of effort, and the book he hoped would, aside from the benefit that it would bring to the scholarly Talmudic world of having such a book, but the book would, in a sense, make him too. And all of that went up in a puff. And you read again in all of his letters, there is an irony about life, a sense of tragedy, almost an acceptance of the fact that it's not going to turn out, that he hasn't got mazel. You know, in Yiddish there's a famous statement that if you have a choice between mazel and money, take mazel. Mazel is a great thing, good fortune. Some people have it, Baruch Hashem. If you have good fortune, so then whatever happens, it's all right. And there are many great people who don't have it, for one reason or another. And he always felt that he didn't have it. And that again only serves to accentuate the accomplishments that the man was able to achieve. We also have, because of this, also it's really a complex personality, because anytime you deal with great people, you're dealing with such a... So you have mixed in that even though on the surface he was a joyful person, and always enthusiastic and happy and a song person who always sang, there's always a tinge of melancholy in it, tinge of sadness, which is also reflected in his writings, and from those who saw him and spoke to him. There always was, they used to say, there was always a krecht at the end. There was always a sigh at the end. And that's a reflection, again, of his own personal life. He never had children. He and his wife never had children. And that was to them a terrible personal tragedy that they found hard to deal with. He would say in the yeshiva, which he founded later, he would say, you are my children, and so every Rebbe says, you are my children. But when he said, you are my children, he meant it literally, and he would always weep because of that, because of the fact that he did not have a family. Now, right before the First World War began, so he had an offer from a Polish city, a small Polish city, but it was an important Polish city, to become the Rav there. And the name of the city was Galena, like Galena in Ohio, where Ulysses S. Grant came from. I've often wondered where the name, very interesting. I think in Ohio there's one original name that comes from, they all come from everywhere. But be that as it may, he was offered to be the Rav in Galena, Poland. In order to stop him from being the Rav, his mother-in-law did two things, very interesting mothers-in-law. Number one, she tried to bribe the people in Galena to change their mind. Secondly, when that didn't work, so she tried to bribe him. The story is that she brought 20,000 gold coins and laid it on the table in front of him and said, here, this is yours, don't go. So his answer to her was classic. His answer to her was that if 20,000 gold coins can change my mind, then you're right, I should not go in the rabbinate. To be a rabbi, 20,000 gold coins should not be able to change your mind. And he went. He left. He went to Galena. In 1911, we find him already in Galena, before the First World War. Now, Galena was representative of Poland. Poland was the bastion of Hasidus, of traditional Jewry, of Jewish scholarship, and at the exact same time, Poland was the bastion of secular Judaism, of socialism, of the Bund, of the labor unions, of communism, and at the same time, it was the bastion of Zionism. Now, to understand Poland Jewish Poland from 1900 to the war, you had three enormous groups, all of whom were very powerful, inimical to each other in every manner and fashion imaginable, all vying for power, all vying for control of the masses and control of the Jewish wealth and talent and for control of Jewish children, which was the ultimate struggle. And Galena had all three elements in it when he came to be the Rav, when he came to be the rabbi. And he was a very strong rabbi, and he was a very strong person. He used to say, a famous quip of his, there's a verse in the Tanakh that says, Ad Yavor Zam. The word Zam means God's anger. Ad Yavor Zam, meaning until that the people should lay low, Ad Yavor Zam, until God's anger dissipates. It's like wait till the thunderstorm is over, then you walk out. So he said the word Zam stood for three things in a community. The Zion stood for Zvochin, meaning the meat, the kashrus of the meat. And the Ayin stood for Erevin, for the Erevin town, which is always, as you know, a cause celebrate in every town. And the Mem stood for the mikveh, for mikvos, because those are the three things that they fought about. Every town, that was the fight. the fight was the butcher's kosher, the butcher's not kosher, it's better, it's worse, it should be better, it could be better. The Erev is good, it's not good. The mikveh is right, it's wrong, you should pick it up, fix it up, it's good. So he said, the job of the rabbi was ad yavor zam, was to dissipate those machlokas. Was to see that those things that were given over to him were in order, and he set about to put them in order. And he did it with a very strong hand. When you do things with a strong hand, you always have controversy that returns. There are three incidents. There's one incident that in Galena, there was a butcher, a Jewish butcher that had a non-Jewish partner, which was very common in Poland. Very common in Poland that the butchers in town, the Jew and the non-Jew, were partners. And the non-Jew was a Polish mafia, if there is such a thing, type. And when he became the Ron, so he told the Jewish partner, the Jewish butcher, that there were certain things in the store that he wanted improved, to raise the level of kashrus, and that he would come by on a regular basis to enforce his recommendation. The Jewish partner told he wasn't going to be the shegit, so he told the shegit that the rabbi says he's going to come and he demands this and this from him. So the first time Meir Shapiro came to the butcher shop, the non-Jew said to him, he said, the next time you walk across that, I'm going to hang you up on a meat hook. The next time you walk in, the butchers always speak directly, right? There's no euphemisms. So he said, I'm going to hang you on the meat hook. So his experience with rabbis until then was that was a sufficient enough threat to discourage them from coming into the shop again. But not Meir Shapiro. The next morning, Meir Shapiro showed up, smiling, beaming, said good morning, walked in like nothing happened. And at the end, the butcher they have to concede. They have to concede that they were going to do it his way. We also have the story there that the halacha is that a Kohen, a member of the priestly family, the Kohanim, who is not a Sabbath observer, should not duchen. He should not give the priestly blessing. In Galena, there apparently were a lot of Kohanim who were not Shomrei Shabbos, but who nevertheless went up to the Bina and duchen. And the first time that they did that on Yom Tiv, it was apparently, I don't know if the story was on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. So he stopped the duchening in the middle and he called out the names of those that were Machalei Shabbos and told them to go off. So he was, as you can see, he was a person of not only strong convictions, but of iron will and of great nerve. You need nerves of steel to do this. And he was unremitting in his war against the masculine, against the secular Jews and the institutions of secular Judaism. He was a great orator. He spoke in... He was an orator in Hebrew, and he was an orator in Yiddish, and he was an orator in Polish. And he was a great orator, and he was a very effective foe. Because in a time when most rabbis only spoke twice a year, and the public domain was controlled by the secular orators or by the Zionist orators, in Galena the situation was different. He was the leading orator in town. So much so that the Polish nationalists invited him to speak for their meetings. Because in a strange fashion, they thought that he was a Polish nationalist also. In the First World War came, and the town was half-wrecked, like all the other towns, occupied by the Germans, by the Austrians, then the Russians came, and then they got thrown out again, and it was just the turmoil. The Jewish wealth was destroyed. The First World War was really a tremendous debacle for the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. After the war, he single-handedly rebuilt the town. He rebuilt the town, not only the shul and the mikveh and the eruv, but he rebuilt the Jewish businesses. He had a great facility for raising money, for being able to mobilize funds. He was a businessman too. He knew how to deal with these things, and therefore his town grew, and he was able to put the town back on its feet. In 1921, he was invited to become the rabbi of a larger town. He was really invited to become the rabbi of Warsaw. But he refused that position because he felt that no rabbi could be effective in Warsaw. And he was not wrong. It's a little like being the rabbi in New York or Jerusalem or somewhere. It's just, it's not manageable. No one personality can make a difference, can make the difference. And he looked rather for a place where he could make a difference, just by the power of his personality. So there was a middle-sized city called Sanuk, which invited him to become the rabbi. He left Galena and he came to Sanuk in 1921. In 1921, he founded in this town two yeshivas, and this really began his career as an educator. Two yeshivas. One yeshiva was a yeshiva in which they learned Torah till 3 in the afternoon, and from 3 in the afternoon till the evening they had trade, shop, professions, carpenter, printer, etc. And he equipped an entire wing of the building with all of the necessary equipment, and he called it the yeshiva Torah ve'avoda, not Torah ve'avoda in the Zionist sense that it took on later, but Torah ve'avoda in the sense of Torah to study, ve'avoda, and that a person should learn how to do work with his hands, to have a trade, to be able to make a living, and that yeshiva was very successful. At the same time, he ran a much smaller yeshiva for the elite students in the town. He ran that in the shul, and he fed them in his home, because since he had no family, he was able to devote himself to his students in this fashion. And that yeshiva was the yeshiva l'mitzuyonim, he called it, the yeshiva for the elite, for the exceptional, and that yeshiva was based upon study of the Talmud exclusively, the development of great Talmudic scholars. We'll see later when he comes to build the yeshiva Chachmei Lublin, that's an expansion of this yeshiva l'mitzuyonim idea. It is interesting that he did not combine the two in one institution. He held that they were not combinable, that there have to be different yeshivas for different groups. In 1922, elections were held for the Polish Parliament. Now, the three main groups that I have outlined within the Jewish people, each had a party that represented them in Parliament, and those parties in turn were like the Jewish people are, like the Knesset has got 28 parties that are running for it. So they were divided into little parties and little parties and little parties. But the main thing was that the Jews ran as a block. There was going to be a Jewish section of Parliament. The Jews did not run as part of the Polish party. It would be like in the United States. In the United States, there are Jews in the Democratic Party and there are Jews in the Republican Party. And there is no such thing as a Jewish party in the United States, even though for many decades Jews have voted overwhelmingly for one party over the other, but nevertheless, there's no exclusive Jewish party, and there's no party that claims to represent Jewish interests. In Poland, the Jewish philosophy was that the only way they would get anything is to have an exclusively Jewish party. That we'll see that really rebounded against the Jews badly, because it isolated them in Parliament, and it allowed the other parties to make all sorts of illegal deals with them and really to corrupt them. But in the first Parliament, 35 Jews were elected, over 10% of the Polish Parliament, and out of the 35 that were elected, 6 were members of Agudat Yisrael, which was the religious party of the time, and one of the 6 was Rabbi Meir Shapiro, so that he was a representative in the Polish Sejm. He was a senator. He was a legislator in the Polish party, in the Polish Parliament. And he was the main defender in the Polish Parliament. The ultra-nationalist Poles, as well as other Poles, would hold long anti-Semitic diatribes. They said that all the problems of Poland were to be solved by getting rid of the Jews. The anti-Semitism in Poland between the wars was unspeakable. And that was the preparatory ground for what was going to happen. And Rabbi Shapiro took the role as being the leading defender of the Jews against the Poles. When he came to the Polish Parliament, he did not speak Polish that well. But when he left, he was one of the great orators in Polish. So much so that even his adversaries always came to hear what the rabbi had to say, the way he said it. He was a clever debater. He was a quick person on his feet. He had a sense of humor, and he knew how to, there's an art in parliamentary debate of how to insult your opponent in such a way that you win the debate. And Meir Shapiro was an expert in that. In 1920, he was 36 years old. He was one of the youngest members of the Polish Parliament. There's a great picture of the 6 Jewish, representatives on the steps of the Polish Parliament. Marvelous picture. In 1923, he traveled to Vienna, where there was the World Congress of the Agudat Yisrael, the Knessia Gedola of the Agudat Yisrael. In that meeting, he proposed 2 great ideas, which were the great ideas of his lifetime. And they were ideas which captured the Jewish people. The first idea was the Daf Hayomi. He's the inventor of the Daf Hayomi. That Jews all over the world should every day study 1 page of the Talmud, and everybody should study that same page. And there would be a regular order, and every 7 years the entire Talmud would be completed. And he saw it as a unifying factor, a tremendously necessary unifying factor amongst the Jewish people. And it's interesting that when he proposed it, there was great opposition to it. Every idea, no matter how good, the mere fact that it's new guarantees opposition. Now, opposition is not bad. It's what tests an idea. It's what tests a person. It's what tests an institution. Without it, you don't really know the metal that's involved. But he had great opposition. Especially did he have opposition from the Lithuanian yeshivas, who felt that the study of 1 page per day would be perfunctory. It wouldn't really convey the depth of Talmudic knowledge, and that it was a gimmick. Time has proven it to be more than a gimmick. Time has proven it to be one of the most enormous educational tools in the history of man, where even today you have hundreds of thousands of people, literally hundreds of thousands of people every day learning the same page of the Talmud throughout the world. So much so that the addicts of the Daf Hayomi give the date by the page that they're on, rather than by what day of the month or the year it is. But that was his revolutionary idea, which he introduced, and the Aguda accepted it, but he financed it. The Aguda never had money, so he financed it personally, raised money throughout the world for it, printed up calendars, publicity, placards, talked it up, And it got going. And every mavzor, every cycle, it has grown and grown and grown. Today it is very strong. It's fostered a host of imitators, which is the highest compliment. To learn a Mishnah a day, Mishnah Yomi, to learn a Mitzvah a day, to learn a Perek in Tehillim a day, to learn a Perek in Tanakh a day. That idea of a set daily universal curriculum that all Jews would follow. His second great idea, and by the way, he said that from the Talmud. He said, if you look at the page of the Talmud, you see the Jews from Palestine and from Babylonia, and on the side, Rashi is from France, and the Balei Pes is from Germany, and in the back you have the Rosh from Toledo in Spain, and the Marsha from Poland, and the Maram from Lithuania. He said the Talmud itself is the universal unifying factor. The page of the Talmud is the most unifying fact in Jewish history, because everybody from every place else in the world, they're all gathered in one place. And where's the place that unifies us? The page on the Talmud. That was his idea. The second idea he had was to make a universal yeshiva in Poland that would be different than all the yeshivas, that would be the place that would produce the leaders, to take only the highest element, the highest caliber of students, to submit them to the most rigorous of training, the highest of demands, intellectual and moral, and to make it beautiful. You have to understand that the yeshivas then were not beautiful. Nobody had a nice building. It's not like today. You go Baruch Hashem to Eretz Yisrael, all the yeshivas have nice buildings, and in the United States, you know, and there's a dining room, and there's food to eat, and there's a dormitory, there's something. That wasn't the way it was. The yeshivas were absolute representatives of poverty, and he said, how can we build a Jewish world in that fashion? We have to build it that it should be as nice as any university. And that again was a revolutionary idea, and again it was opposed. They said, no, you're not allowed to do that in yeshiva. He had a friend, Shmuel Eichenbaum, who was one of the wealthiest Jews in Lublin, and he owned an empty lot in the middle of Lublin, Lubotrovsk 57, which was, like owning, let's say, a piece of land on Fifth Avenue in New York City, or on Michigan Boulevard in Chicago, on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, right? Prime property. And he went and he said, Shmuel, give me that piece of land, and we're going to build a yeshiva there. It's, you have to really sticking it to the goyim, to everybody. Imagine you're not building out where nobody sees you, right? It's not 36 Carlton Road. Suffer. And his friend, a great man, he gave it to him, right? You got to have a mansion, like the Jewish developers today would, they trade him, they send him somewhere else. You can't give him away. You're not going to give him away, Trump Tower. But he gave him the piece of land. And in 1924 on Lag BaOmer, they had the cornerstone laying for the yeshiva at that lot. 50,000 Jews came to the cornerstone laying. He was a master in media also. He brought the heads of the Polish government there too. And he spoke in Hebrew, and he spoke in Yiddish, and he spoke in Polish. And there he said the famous quip that, that he had, now he had everything, but he didn't have the money. In 1924, to help raise the money, he left the little smaller town of Sanuk, and he became the rabbi of Pietrikov, which was a much larger community, which gave him a larger base. And he started to raise funds for the yeshiva in Lublin, which was a tremendous undertaking. And it was a one-man show, all on his shoulders. The building was built from 1924 to 1927, and he needed $150,000 to complete the building. Well, today, $150,000, even, Rabbi somebody said to me last week that they need $500,000 for something. I said, gee, I remember the days when I also only needed $500,000. $500,000 is nothing by me anymore. So $150,000, you know. But he needed in the 1920s $150,000. He came to the United States, and he was in the United States from 1927 to 1928, almost a year and a half, collecting the money. He toured the United States. It was a grand tour. And he got the money. He raised the money. And the building was built. He also left a profound effect upon American Jewry. I knew Jews yet that said, you know, I shook hands with him. I mean, he had that type of electricity to him. And he resigned from the parliament in 1928 to devote himself to finishing the yeshiva. The yeshiva had a magnificent building. It had gold letters on it. The gold Hebrew letters are on it today. The Polackans still have the building. They didn't give it back to you. Still has the Hebrew letters on it. And it had a garden. And it had landscaping. And it had a dormitory. It had electricity. Indoor plumbing. It had a library of 20,000 volumes that he wanted to raise to 100,000 volumes. The Nazis burned the entire library in one night in the street in front of the yeshiva. He had a miniature Beis HaMikdash built in the lobby. I mean, it was different. He wanted that the students should wear uniforms, but that he felt that would pull the string too tight. They would be too different. So he left it without that. The yeshiva opened. It was the greatest celebration of Jewish Poland. The Marshal Pilsudski himself, the head of the Polish government, came to open the yeshiva. But that was opened in 1930, and in 1930 he moved from Pietrikov to become the Rav of Lublin, where the yeshiva was. But by 1933, the debt of the yeshiva was so great that he made an agreement with the people of Lodz that he would become the Rav in Lodz if they paid off all the debts of the yeshiva in Lublin. And they agreed. And he was going to leave Lublin and sacrifice that in order to go to Lodz, in order that the yeshiva should have money. But by then he was already sick. He had angina. He suffered from pneumonia. And in 1933, on the 6th day of Cheshvan, in the year Tov Reish Tzadik Daled, he was 46 years old. On a Friday, he died. And when he died, it's like his death made such an impression upon the Jewish world. His funeral was on Sunday. Hundreds of thousands of people came. All Poland stopped, not just Jewish Poland. All Poland stopped. And he was one of the great figures. He left in his will that if the yeshiva fails, interesting, if the yeshiva fails, if they're unable to keep it going after his death, then all the land and the buildings should go to the Talmud Torah, to the elementary Jewish education in Lublin. Yeshiva did not fail, but Poland failed. The Jewish community was destroyed. The building still stands today. But he was the greatest innovator in Jewish life. And everybody imitated him afterwards. And I heard it from the Panovich Rav himself. He said, you know, he's going to be the Litvisher of Meir Shapiro. He said, he's going to be the Lithuanian of Meir. Going to also build he's the one that picked Torah up and raised it on the banner. And so an enormous person with a great personality who left an indelible mark upon us. and whose life story is well worth knowing because of the effect that it has upon us and upon all the Jewish people. Yes, that's absolutely right, that he was disinterred, and he's buried now in Eretz Yisrael. But his grave was the only grave that was left in Lublin, in the Jewish cemetery, and they took him out, and he's buried now in Jerusalem. So, yeah, they say the body was whole, and they took him out. I heard that too. But he's buried now. He's buried in Jerusalem, in Har HaMenucha. Reb Meir Leibush ben Yechiel Michal, who is known to us as